For centuries, the samurai stood at what was the center of power in Japan. They served powerful lords, governed provinces, formed the warrior elite of a rigid social order that shaped Japanese society as a whole for many generations. Their authority symbolized by the two swords they carried at their sides, a privilege reserved only for the members of the samurai class. That system, in some shape or another, had survived civil wars, political upheaval, the rise and fall of some of Japanese history's most powerful figures and families. To many people living in Japan at that time, the rule of the samurai must have seemed like a permanent, never-ending aspect of the world around them. Yet, in the second half of the 19th century, that world began to change with astonishing speed. Because while the samurai held a firm grasp on power in Japan for close to 700 years at that point, it would take little more than 2 decades for that entire system to collapse, and for the samurai themselves to disappear from the Japanese power structure entirely. The reasons for this transformation were incredibly complex. From foreign pressure to internal political turmoil and a rapid push toward modernization, all of it would play a role in reshaping Japan during this very turbulent period. And in the process, the warrior class that had once defined Japan for so long would finally lose its status and the privileges that had once set them apart. How did that happen? Who was involved and what were the consequences, the positives and the negatives of the fall of the samurai class? That is exactly what we're here to find out in today's video. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the story of how the age of the samurai came to an end. Before we start asking how the samurai came to an end in the mid-19th century, it's probably worth asking another question first. What exactly were the samurai at that point in their long history, and how did they reach that position in the first place? Don't worry, I'll keep this one nice and short. So, the word samurai originally meant to serve, and that is precisely the role that they fulfilled. But who was it that they were serving exactly? Well, above them stood the daimyo, powerful landowners and regional warlords who governed their respective domains. These daimyo, in turn, they answered to the shogun, the military ruler who stood at the very top of this political order and who oversaw the entire realm that we now call Japan. Now, even though the samurai technically served those above them, they were still part of Japan's ruling military elite. In the very rigid social hierarchy of the time, they stood above peasants, craftsmen, merchants, and everyone else who occupied the lower tiers of society. Members of this elite also enjoyed many privileges that others did not, the most obvious one being of course the right to carry swords, the now iconic katana, weapons that were not only practical tools of warfare, but also powerful symbols of status. After all, the samurai were a warrior class, trained for combat and often devoting their entire lives to martial discipline and battlefield tactics. The hierarchy surrounding the samurai and the ranks above them was far more complex than this short explanation would suggest. But in simple terms, the samurai were Japan's hereditary warrior elite. And when historians speak about the end of the samurai, what they really mean is the collapse of the entire system that supported them, a political and social order that had governed Japan in one form or another since the late 12th century. The first military government of this kind came with the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate in the late 1100s. With its rise, the emperor, traditionally viewed as a divine figure, was reduced from a leader of the realm to a largely symbolic figurehead, while real power shifted to the newly established feudal military administration that actually controlled the country, the shogunate, the de facto rulers of Japan. And so, over the next 4 centuries following the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate, Japan experienced repeated upheaval. Rebellions, betrayals, civil wars, and political fragmentation were common as rival factions struggled for power. This very long era of instability finally ended in early 17th century, when Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Tokugawa clan succeeded in reunifying the country. And with that reunification came something that Japan had not experienced in centuries. Peace. Relative peace. During the Tokugawa era, also known as the Edo period, samurai still retained their privileges, including the exclusive rights to carry a sword. But at the same time, they were increasingly needed less and less on the actual battlefield. I mean, obviously, frankly, there were few wars left to fight at this point. And so, many samurai instead became bureaucrats, administrators, or scholars, working within the government rather than on the front lines of war. Others were just incredibly bored. This was back when peace was boring, you know? However, this entire peace and stability was maintained not only by a powerful central government ruling from the city of Edo, but also by Japan's decision to close itself off from much of the outside world. Policy famously known as Sakoku. Sakoku was a system that tightly controlled foreign contact and limited trade to a handful of approved nations, locations, and carefully regulated conditions. Japan's self-imposed isolation incredibly lasted for most of the Tokugawa period. We're talking around 250 years here. So much for this seemingly off-topic introduction, which, as you will see, is actually not off-topic at all, because the first cracks in Japan's isolationist system would also mark the first domino to fall in the collapse of the samurai and the entire political structure built around them. The beginning of that process can actually be traced to one very specific date, July 8th, 1853. On that fateful day, near the town of Uraga at the entrance to Edo Bay, 4 enormous black ships suddenly appeared on the horizon. They looked unlike anything most Japanese had ever seen before, and for good reason, because these vessels, they weren't Japanese at all. They were American. Standing aboard one of those ships was a certain Matthew C. Perry of the United States Navy, who had sailed directly into Edo Bay with little to no regard for Japan's well-established diplomatic protocol. Ballsy move? Perry, he had no intention of negotiating through the slow, usual channels. What he wanted was his demands to be delivered directly to the 12th Tokugawa shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, the very man who ruled Japan. And his demands were rather simple. After more than 200 years of self-imposed isolation, it was time for Japan to finally open its borders to American trade. Perry and his fleet were certainly not there to invade Japan or anything. Still, the display of power was impossible to ignore. Shogun and his officials, they quickly realized that they were in absolutely no position to challenge the modern technology of these foreign steam-powered warships. Their forces were equipped to deal with the kinds of vessels common in the 17th century, but what had just arrived in Edo Bay basically came from 200 years into the future. In that sense, the arrival of the Perry expedition to Japan was deeply symbolic too. It revealed just how far Japan had fallen behind much of the world in areas such as military technology and industry especially. While other nations the world over were undergoing rapid transformation, Japan was basically stuck in the 1600s while the 20th century was slowly approaching. And now, with American warships anchored in Edo Bay and awaiting a response, the message was impossible to ignore. The rest of the world was advancing rapidly. Foreign influence was beginning to surround Japan. Under those circumstances, remaining isolated indefinitely was simply no longer a realistic option. Sure enough, Japan would finally open its doors just not immediately. Perry agreed to leave and returned the following year, giving the shogunate some time to consider how it should respond. In the meantime, other foreign powers, such as Russia, began arriving in Japan in much the same way, presenting polite requests backed by unmistakable shows of force. True to his word, Matthew C. Perry then returned in 1854, and this time an agreement was reached. The United States was granted access to several trading ports in Japan, and over time, more such arrangements would follow. Other nations soon negotiated similar agreements. Very quickly, one fact became very clear. The foreigners were coming to Japan, and they were here to stay. They entered and departed Japanese ports freely, established communities on Japanese soil, and in many cases were largely exempt from Japanese law, instead being tried under the legal systems of their own countries, which was certainly a choice. That entire situation quickly became very complicated, unfolding during what was an already complicated period for the ruling Tokugawa shogunate. Its authority was weakening as is, and Tokugawa Ieyasu died only weeks after Perry's first visit in 1853. And now you had foreigners arriving from all different directions, some openly disregarding Japanese laws while regarding the Japanese themselves as inferior. At the same time, the internal mechanisms through which the shogunate had maintained control over the country were beginning to change as well. One of the most important of these systems was known as Sankin Kotai, or alternate attendance system. Under this arrangement, daimyo were required to spend alternating years in their own domains and in the capital city of Edo, where the shogun's court was located. As for their wives and eldest sons, those remained in Edo permanently, effectively serving as hostages to guarantee the loyalty of their lords. This system, as cruel as some parts of it definitely were, had successfully helped maintain stability for more than 2 centuries. But in 1862, 9 years after the arrival of Perry and the foreigners, it was abolished. Yet another sign that the old order was rapidly beginning to unravel in front of the eyes of the ruling class. As these historic developments unfolded, many Japanese, mainly influential samurai leaders in powerful domains, slowly began losing faith in the once mighty Tokugawa shogunate. In their eyes, the government seemed to be giving in to the demands of foreign powers, the barbarians as they like to call them. And then there was the emperor. As mentioned earlier, the Emperor of Japan had largely been reduced to a ceremonial figure with the establishment of the first shogunate in the late 12th century. Prior to that shift, however, the Emperor and the imperial court had held genuine political authority as one might expect from a traditional monarchy. And over the centuries, there were occasional attempts to restore that power to the imperial line. 2 well-known examples would be the Chokyu Rebellion of 1221 and the Kenmu Restoration of 1333. Both represented efforts by the imperial court to reclaim control from the military government, efforts that ultimately failed. The shogunate retained power, and the military rulers continued to dominate Japanese politics for centuries afterwards. But now, in the mid-19th century, Japan suddenly found itself under all that pressure to modernize and engage with the outside world, while at the same time the leadership of the Tokugawa shogunate appeared increasingly weak. And in such a moment of uncertainty, a rare opportunity emerged. Perhaps the greatest chance in centuries for the emperor to reclaim political influence on behalf of the imperial court. The man who occupied the imperial throne at the time was the 121st Emperor of Japan, Emperor Kome. This man did not hesitate long to take advantage of the situation. You see, Kome was a man strongly opposed to the growing presence of foreigners in Japan, and he made his position clear. The subjugation of the hated foreigner is the greatest of the national tasks facing us, he declared, which was also an unmistakable jab towards the shogunate and its hesitant response to the arrival of the Western powers. Then, in March of 1863, Emperor Kome went even further. He issued an order demanding that all foreigners must leave Japan within 60 days. Well aware that the shogunate lacked the power to enforce such a decree, that sneaky bastard. But that was precisely the point. That order simultaneously highlighted the weakness of the Tokugawa shogunate, while also allowing the emperor to present himself as a stronger and more decisive leader. And at the same time, new political movements began to appear across the country, rallying around the slogan Sonno Jōi, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. It was a movement that gained support from several powerful samurai domains, among the most influential of which were the samurai of Satsuma domain, one of the wealthiest and most powerful regions of Edo period Japan. In the summer of 1863, samurai from Satsuma domain became involved in violent clashes with British forces near Kagoshima, and around the same time, samurai from the nearby Choshu domain began firing on foreign ships passing through the Shimonoseki Strait just for the love of the game. These incidents, they reflected what was a growing frustration among many samurai toward the increasing presence of Western powers in Japan. Numerous domains were becoming more and more hostile toward the so-called barbarians who had forced their way into Japanese affairs, and the result was that many of these samurai began rallying behind Emperor Kome and his well-known anti-foreign stance. And in doing so, they were also sending a clear message to the Tokugawa shogunate. The existing political order was losing legitimacy fast. Tensions rose. More and more dissatisfied samurai began gathering in the city of Kyoto, then capital of Japan and the seat of both the emperor and the imperial court. The growing number of anti-Tokugawa warriors in the city soon became so much of a concern that when the ruling shogun Tokugawa Iemochi visited Kyoto, the situation had become so tense that he required the protection of a special guard, made up of roughly 200 ronin or masterless samurai, a force that became known as the Shinsen-gumi. The group quickly developed a reputation for ruthlessness. Even after the shogun's visit ended, the Shinsen-gumi remained in Kyoto, policing the city and cracking down on anyone suspected of plotting against the Tokugawa shogunate. And their methods were often brutal. They targeted anyone who showed even the slightest sign of disloyalty or conspiracy. And no one attracted more suspicion from both the Shinsen-gumi and the shogunate than the samurai of Choshu domain. According to the Shinsen-gumi, members of Choshu domain were planning a bold conspiracy. They intended to set the capital ablaze, abduct the emperor, then use him as a puppet to legitimize a new government led by Choshu. Now, whether these accusations were entirely accurate, that remains a bit unclear. But the response was immediate. The Shinsen-gumi intensified its campaign throughout Kyoto, searching every nook and cranny for Choshu supporters. Eventually, the shogunate itself intervened and issued a direct order. All samurai from the Choshu domain were to leave Kyoto. The deadline, July 19th, 1864. The Choshu domain refused to comply. But not only that, in fact, the day before the deadline expired, their forces marched toward Kyoto. Subsequently, fighting broke out in the city between Choshu samurai and troops loyal to the Tokugawa government, with the shogunate's forces ultimately emerging victorious. The conflict itself, though, far from over. Choshu had become public enemy number one, and so 2 separate military expeditions were organized to crush the rebellious domain. Expeditions that, in what was somewhat of an unlikely twist, involved actual cooperation between Emperor Kome and the shogunate. But that wasn't the only unexpected development. Another domain expected to assist in the campaign was Satsuma, a traditional rival of Choshu. Surely they would find great pleasure in crushing their fierce rival. But rather than fighting against them, Satsuma suddenly chose to support Choshu domain. By the time the second expedition was launched, in the summer of 1866, both sides had strengthened their forces considerably. With the assistance of Scottish merchant Thomas Glover, Choshu got its hands on modern firearms and military supplies. Satsuma suddenly had a steam-powered industrial plant, smelting works, a distillery, even a chemical factory. The British were likely aware of these transactions, by the way, but they didn't inform the shogunate. Meanwhile, the shogunate itself sought help of its own. French military advisors were brought in to assist with training and organization, but despite these efforts, the second campaign against Choshu ultimately ended in failure. That defeat, as you can probably imagine, was kind of a blow to the Tokugawa government, and perhaps something that gave the ruling shogun's heart one final push in the wrong, or the right direction depending on who you ask, because only weeks later, Tokugawa Iemochi passed away, and the timing was impeccable. Emperor Komei also didn't make it much longer, passing away in January of 1867, and suddenly leadership on both sides of Japan's political divide were changing, because what followed would prove to be the final transfer of power of Japan's samurai era. The new emperor was the late Emperor Komei's son, the then barely 15-year-old Mutsuhito, who ascended the throne on January 30th, 1867 as Emperor Meiji. The term Meiji Restoration, or Meiji Isshin in Japanese, refers to that entire decisive political upheaval that would ultimately bring an end to the rule of the shogunate. It was a transformation of enormous significance, a revolution of quite literally divine proportions that restored political authority to the emperor and dismantled the centuries-old power structures that had defined Japan's feudal order. Of course, this is when the samurai class and the system that supported it would finally start to disappear. The idea of restoring imperial authority had already been discussed within the imperial court during the final years of Emperor Komei's reign. Even then, however, it remained a controversial topic. Many believed the moment was not yet right to challenge the power of the shogunate directly, but that all changed when the question of the next shogun arose, because the appointment of a young, new military ruler suddenly presented the very opportunity the imperial court had been waiting for. One of the last major political developments during Emperor Komei's nearly 30-year-long reign was the succession within the Tokugawa shogunate itself. The man chosen to take over was Tokugawa Yoshinobu, 28 years old, 15th shogun of the Tokugawa line, and as history would show, the last shogun Japan would ever have. Can we just pause here for a second and appreciate how wild it is that we have actual, real photographs of a shogun? I think that's just kind of incredible, really. But I don't know. Let me know if it's just me who's fascinated here. Anyway, Yoshinobu's tenure as shogun was unusual from the very beginning. Upon assuming the position, he immediately inherited the political crisis that had troubled his predecessor. Powerful domains, influential samurai, rival factions across the country dissatisfied with Tokugawa rule. Many of these domains and factions, like the samurai of Satsuma and Choshu, were itching to challenge the authority of the shogunate by force. In short, Yoshinobu had inherited not only the title of shogun, but also all of the enemies that came with it. And his solution to the crisis was perhaps a little unexpected. Just over a year into his reign, he chose to surrender power voluntarily. Kind of. On November 8, 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu formally renounced the administrative authority of his office and returned governing power to the imperial court. Shortly afterward, he withdrew from Kyoto and relocated to Osaka. In essence, Yoshinobu accepted he would now act merely as a servant of imperial authority, rather than the country's supreme military ruler. Then, 10 days later, on November 19th, he took the step even further and requested to give up the title of shogun entirely. It was an extraordinary and historic move, one that Yoshinobu likely hoped would diffuse the growing tensions and preserve his own position within the new political order. But that decision came too late to prevent what was already unfolding. The domains most strongly opposed Tokugawa rule, again Satsuma domain and Choshu domain, had already begun planning their next steps. Throughout November and December of 1867, leaders from these domains secretly started to prepare military action against the Tokugawa clan. Their objective was clear: strip the Tokugawa of their remaining lands and permanently remove them from power. You have to keep in mind, even without the title of shogun, Yoshinobu and the Tokugawa family still remained enormously influential. Official authority might have been transferred back to the imperial court, sure, but the Tokugawa clan still controlled significant territory and political influence. At the same time, early plans for the new government included the creation of a council made up of daimyo from several major domains, and although Yoshinobu had given up the title of shogun, he would still have been one of the most powerful lords in Japan. In such a council, the Tokugawa clan might easily have retained a leading role and continued to dominate national politics, just without that fancy old shogun title attached to it. For the leaders of Satsuma and Choshu especially, this was absolutely unacceptable. They had no intention of allowing the Tokugawa to maintain influence in this new political system. So, on January 3rd, 1868, the two allied domains took decisive action, in what would be yet another watershed moment in Japanese history. Their forces seized control of the imperial palace in Kyoto, where they then compelled the young Emperor Meiji to officially declare the restoration of imperial authority. At the same time, they pressured the assembled court officials into formally abolishing the office of shogun and ordering the confiscation of Tokugawa Yoshinobu's lands. Then, 2 weeks later, on January 17th, 1868, Tokugawa Yoshinobu responded to this by announcing that he would not recognize the proclamation issued by the imperial court. Events then escalated further soon afterwards. Following an arson attack in the women's quarters of Edo Castle, Yoshinobu decided to prepare a military response against the forces of Satsuma and Choshu stationed in the capital. Then, on January 27th, the Tokugawa army advanced toward Kyoto and clashed with troops from the Satsuma and Choshu domains near the villages of Toba and Fushimi at the southern entrance to the capital city. And just like that, the Battle of Toba-Fushimi had begun, and it would go down in history as the opening battle of the Boshin War, the final, large-scale conflict of Japan's samurai era. When it came to sheer numbers, Tokugawa still looked rather formidable. The force marching toward the capital numbered around 15,000 men, handily outmatching the imperial troops from Satsuma and Choshu stationed in Kyoto by roughly 3-1. Parts of the shogunate army had even been trained by French military advisors, and among their ranks were also the aforementioned Shinsengumi, arguably the most loyal and disciplined fighters the Tokugawa could rely on. And yet, despite all of that, the imperial forces were far from an easy opponent. When it came to weaponry, they held a clear edge, benefiting from their close ties to the British and access to more modern arms. And so, the Battle of Toba-Fushimi turned into a hard-fought conflict, dragging on into February without a decisive advantage on either side. Until things suddenly shifted. Several daimyo who had previously been considered loyal to the shogun suddenly decided to switch sides mid-conflict. Among them were the lords of the Yodo and Tsu domains, whose defection tipped the balance in favor of the imperial army and ultimately forced the Tokugawa troops into retreat. Suddenly, the opening battle of the Boshin War ended in defeat for Tokugawa Yoshinobu, a rather devastating blow. The former shogun fled back to Edo, and while Tokugawa forces managed a small-scale naval victory at the Battle of Awa shortly before, it did little to change the overall trajectory of the conflict. From that point on, the situation only got worse and worse for the Tokugawa. Any hope of foreign support vanished when foreign powers formally recognized the new imperial government. At the same time, imperial troops led by Satsuma domain's very own Saigo Takamori began advancing northeast, heading straight for Edo, the home of the Tokugawa clan. That advance culminated in March of 1868 at the Battle of Koshu Katsunuma in present-day Yamanashi, where imperial forces were able to secure a decisive victory. From there, Saigo Takamori was able to move to encircle Edo itself, and the remaining resistance in and around the city was crushed during the Battle of Ueno on July 4th, 1868. Though by then, Tokugawa Yoshinobu had already surrendered and handed over Edo Castle without any further bloodshed. He was then placed under house arrest, stripped of his titles and lands, and eventually retired to Shizuoka, mirroring the path of his ancestor Tokugawa Ieyasu centuries earlier. And that was it. The rule of the Tokugawa had officially come to an end. Still, the Boshin War, that one wasn't over just yet. Between mid-1868 and early 1869, the imperial forces kept themselves busy by moving across the rest of Japan to eliminate any and all remaining resistance to the new government. And there was quite a bit of that left, actually. Groups of samurai loyalists started to settle north after the fall of Edo. Most actually surrendered without a fight, intimidated by the sheer presence of the imperial banner, while others chose to resist in spectacular fashion. One such group, composed in part of former Shinsengumi members, made its way to the southern tip of Ezo, or modern-day Hokkaido, which at the time lay just outside the firm administrative control of both the shogunate and the imperial court. There, they established what they called the Republic of Ezo, a short-lived, samurai-led state that claimed loyalty to the emperor while maintaining its independence from the new Meiji government. These guys even had a pretty fancy stronghold, the star-shaped fortress of Goryokaku in Hakodate, and with the help of a handful of former French military advisors who unbelievably had resigned their posts to join their leadership, the Republic of Ezo attempted to organize a modern defense. A defense that didn't last too long. The Imperial Army was determined to crush all remaining opposition, and that is exactly what they did. By June of 1869, the leaders of the Republic of Ezo had surrendered. With that, Japan's first and only very short-lived republic disappeared, almost as quickly as it had emerged. And so, with resistance across the country finally extinguished, the Meiji government could finally begin consolidating its power. The goal was pretty clear-cut: unify Japan under imperial rule, dismantle the old feudal order, and push the country into a new era of rapid modernization. Rapid is exactly the key word here, because change came fast. And I mean real fast. In late 1868, the emperor's residence was moved from Kyoto to Edo. The city was renamed Tokyo, or Eastern Capital, and became the new center of power, ending Kyoto's centuries-long status as Japan's capital, a role it had held with only brief interruptions since the year 794. The Kanto region, where Tokyo is located, had long been considered to be the true power base of the country. Now, it was finally officially recognized as such. From Tokyo, the Meiji government would begin reshaping Japan, and few would feel those changes more than the samurai. There's a certain irony to this entire thing. I mean, after all, it was the alliance between the powerful samurai domains of Satsuma and Choshu that had helped bring Emperor Meiji to power in the first place, but that didn't protect the class that they belonged to. Oh no, not by a long shot. By 1871, the government had completely abolished the Han system entirely, which saw the 261 feudal domains that had defined Japan dissolved and reorganized into 305 prefectures, a structure that, in heavily modified form, still exists today. The former daimyo of these now-defunct domains were compensated with noble titles modeled after European systems. You know, count, duke, prince, and many were offered positions within the new government, along with financial compensation, of course. All things considered, I think it's fair to say that the samurai had landed on their feet. The samurai class as a whole, however, that was a different story. By 1873, a new Japanese imperial army had been established, modeled after Western powers and open to commoners. Shocking, I know. On top of that, uniforms, hairstyles, training, everything about this new force signaled a break from the past. Their exclusive right to carry swords in public also abolished, stripping away what was one of the most defining symbols of their status, and by 1877, the traditional rice stipends that had sustained samurai for centuries were also eliminated. In less than a decade, the samurai class had effectively been dismantled. Which, I know, raises one very obvious question. Why did the very samurai who helped restore imperial rule allow this to happen in the first place? The answer is, they didn't fully expect it. The samurai who backed the emperor were probably intelligent enough to understand that modernization was inevitable, but many believe that alongside the restoration of imperial authority, a new competent shogun, ideally from their own ranks, would be appointed, kind of a reward for their role in reshaping Japan. But that's where they were gravely mistaken, because as we just explored, more or less the opposite what was materialized in the end. And for some, that felt like a betrayal. A number of former samurai, particularly those who rejected their fancy new titles of Duke and Count, began to resist. Uprisings broke out across several former samurai strongholds across Japan, but none of them would be more significant than the one led by Saigo Takamori. Remember, this was the man who had helped imperial forces to victory, undoubtedly one of the most key figures of the entire Meiji Restoration, and he was furious. Perhaps disillusioned by the dismantling of the samurai class, but mostly mad that his proposal to invade Korea was rejected, Saigo Takamori resigned from all his government positions in 1873 and returned to his hometown of Kagoshima. There, beginning in 1874, he established a series of private academies where he and his followers spent the next 3 years preparing for what they saw as an inevitable confrontation. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. The final stand of the samurai. The government, fully aware of what was probably brewing over there, had made multiple attempts to infiltrate Saigo's circle with spies, most of whom never even made it back. Subsequently, it eventually got to a point where open war broke out in Kyushu, where roughly 20,000 of the Satsuma samurai under Saigo Takamori faced a brand new, modern imperial army. For an impressive 7 months, they held their ground, a remarkable display of resistance against what was a far larger, completely modernized force. But you know what happened next. It didn't last. It couldn't. By September 24th, 1877, the rebellion had been crushed, with only a handful of Saigo's men remaining, and Saigo himself mortally wounded that same day. The exact circumstances of his death remain debated, but the most widely accepted version holds that he was granted what the samurai would have referred to as an honorable death. If true, it would have been an end befitting the man with perhaps the strongest claim to the title of the last samurai. With the end of Saigo Takamori and the Satsuma Rebellion, the history of the samurai had now well and truly come to an end. And that is how Japan brought an end to its warrior elite. Quite a story. But what came next, and what exactly was the legacy of the samurai? Well, in many ways, their disappearance coincided with one of the most dramatic transformations in Japanese history. Faced with the real possibility of falling under the influence or even control of Western powers, Japan moved quickly to modernize. Infrastructure expanded at an astonishing pace. Roads, factories, railways, a modern postal system, even a nationwide telegraph network. Many of these were already in place before that final samurai rebellion had even been crushed. At the same time, private companies like Mitsubishi, then still a shipping firm, received strong government backing to, help them compete on a global stage. Politically, the country was reshaped just as dramatically. In 1885, Ito Hirobumi became Japan's first prime minister, playing a central role in drafting the Meiji Constitution of 1889 and establishing the cabinet system. With that came the Imperial Diet, the foundation of Japan's modern parliamentary system. In short, Japan was transforming into a major world power, and it was happening fast. But here's where the irony of it all kicks in. In dismantling its traditional warrior class in the name of modernization, Japan would soon become more outwardly militaristic than ever before. For much of its history, conflict in Japan had largely been internal. Wars were fought within its own borders between rival clans and factions almost constantly. But as the country began looking outward for inspiration, politically, technologically, economically, it also began to look outward in terms of conflict and expansion. Within just a few decades, beginning in the 1890s, Japan found itself involved in a series of major conflicts. The Sino-Japanese Wars, the Russo-Japanese War, the annexation of Korea, the occupation of Taiwan and Manchuria, and ultimately its role in the Second World War, beginning with the attack on Pearl Harbor. All of these were carried out by the new, modern Imperial Japanese army that was so different from the samurai class. And yet, even as the samurai themselves had disappeared, their image had not. Not completely. Many of the officers leading Japan's modern army were, after all, former samurai or their descendants, men who had traded swords and topknots for uniforms and rifles. At the same time, certain ideals usually associated with the samurai, discipline, loyalty, and a refusal to surrender carried over into this new military culture. For better or for worse. Mostly for the worse. What is interesting, however, is that some of the strongest fascination with the samurai came not from Japan, but from the West. As early as 1899, works like Nitobe Inazo's Bushido, The Soul of Japan introduced international audiences to a highly romanticized vision of the samurai. This image of the honorable, disciplined warrior quickly took hold, feeding into a broader fascination with Japan as this distant and mysterious culture. That exact fascination persisted well into the 20th century, even as Japan became a wartime enemy of much of the Western world. American propaganda films like Know Your Enemy Japan from 1945 attempted to draw direct connections between the samurai past and Japan's wartime actions, often blending history with, let's call it heavy-handed stereotypes. And yet, even that didn't diminish the appeal. If anything, the samurai would experience a kind of rebirth after World War II. Just not on the battlefield, but on the silver screen. Japan's film industry, already established well before the war, entered a golden age in the decades following the war. At the forefront of this were the Chidaigeki, or period pieces, many of them centered around samurai and their stories. Films like Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai from 1954 or Masaki Kobayashi's Harakiri from 1962 were successful and influential not just in their native Japan, but even managed to influence the very movie industries that inspired their directors, namely the American movie industry. But even into the 21st century, through all the industry trends and fads, the appeal of samurai stories never faded. The idea of warriors bound by honor, fighting for something greater than themselves, coupled with some good old drama, intrigue, and betrayal, that is something that continues to resonate with people far beyond Japan's borders. That appeal also comes with a bit of a catch. It's easy to romanticize the samurai, to see them as noble warriors defined by honor and discipline, and while there is certainly truth in that image, it also risks overlooking a much simpler reality. At their core, the samurai were soldiers, warriors shaped by the needs of their time. But hey, if nothing else, their lasting presence in global culture certainly proves one thing. The Japanese are masters at marketing their own culture, traditions, and history and the samurai class remains perhaps the most compelling part of Japanese history, the story of which, even centuries later, refuses to fade away.
所詮武士の面目などと申す者は単にその上辺だけを飾る者。
Man, that story took quite a while to tell, didn't it? Thank you so much for sticking around until the very end. Making these videos takes a lot of time and effort, so as always, a like and a subscribe are greatly appreciated. So is supporting me over on my Patreon page, where you can join this list of amazing people, including the Hockey Channelman, Sachsenfuchs, D-Fox, Saikajo, Khalid Lepta, Xoyabu, Tricoat, Kevin Hickson, Buns, Michael Smith, RK0, Hajime no James, Utku Hussein Kaya, Steve Matsui, Hypanen, Javier Soravia, Midnight Channel, CJ and Mary, Turam, Journeyman351, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, White Gilden, Sierra DC, T-Bird, Metal Mama, Boo Cakes, Ian Farmer, Chris Wallace, JR Horse, Adeye Okono, and Guillaume Clement y Garcia. And to everyone else who decided to tune in this time, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.